Millennia is Paradox's newly announced 4X strategy game, and I've played it. Last time in my gameplay discussion video, you gave me a whole load of questions, and thank you for those. In this video, I'm going to answer your top questions about Millennia. First things first though, let's get our YouTube housekeeping out of the way. It is an important part of inspiration for me, and let's jump in. First up, there were lots of questions or comments around the exact style of the game. John0387 says, so it's kind of like a traditional 4X game. Reminds me a bit of Civ 5. I'm glad we're getting more. And to be really precise, yes, this is by and large a 4X game. It plays like a 4X game, all of the X's are there. I would argue though that some of its elements are maybe a little bit more grandiose, or they go a bit deeper into simulation than we've seen before. We'll talk about it in the third question, but the tile improvements and the way that they interact with the economy are one example. Next question is from Baron Jutta, who asks, I'm getting some old world vibes from this, which has frequently been described as Civ and CK3 having a baby. Would you say there's similar vibes here? Well, if we take a look at old world, I think that one thing is for certain, it does look kind of like it. Although many 4X games share similar looks, this one does have more of a kind of grittier, rustic feel to its graphics, and we'll talk about the graphics in a bit. But to get to your question around the actual gameplay itself, I would say no, not quite. Old World, as you can see, is described as a blend between 4X and Crusader Kings 3 because of its dynasty building effect. You build a family, they have relationships, events, they interact with one another, and that's why that comparison is often made. I wouldn't make that same comparison for Millennia. Nope. Third question, and I've cheated and asked two. Turtle Princip 5587 says, how much interaction do cities have with their surrounding terrain? How many varieties of improvements can you place on the land? And they also then ask about the barbarians or the city-states. I'm going to tackle the terrain first, because it's big. In this game, there are more tile improvements than I've seen, or at least that I'm familiar with. It takes a lot of the things that might traditionally be buildings in cities and pulls them out. One example, you can start with a foresting camp, then it moves to lumber yards. You can also have sawmill productions, and then later game productions for that same resource. And the city relies on you producing that resource within it through the tile improvements in order to ensure that you can actually keep that production chain efficient and effective. Diving into one example here, just off the top of my head, I can see a coal power plant, a more advanced farm that's been upgraded through the ages, several what look to be lumber camps, some housing districts, an education district, some kind of more advanced food processing facility, because while you might start with just the basic grain, then you could build a bakery, say, make some bread, turn it into flour, and then move your way through, as you advance the ages, into more advanced tile improvements. The mines as well, by the way, it's in this game not just as simple as mine, but instead there are clay pits, rare earth metal mines, coal, oil, every single sort of individual thing has a speciality. And on your second question about the barbs, AI, city-states, at the moment it seems pretty limited in the game. Barbarians, don't get me wrong, are everywhere, and the reason why I show you this screenshot is because when you defeat them or clear their camp, you'll often get some kind of event. Not this one because it's about a temple, but I hope you get the idea. Broadly speaking, it doesn't seem like the city-states really play a significant role. They seem to kind of be a little bit like barbarian cities, and they just sort of sit there and you can go and take them if you like. I'm not quite sure whether these mechanics will be fleshed out further. Get back to the start. I see national flags in the screenshot, says RJ Gold 777. Do you pick a civ that has bonuses and sticks with you throughout the game? Or is it more like picking a culture in humankind? Or maybe, is it just cosmetic? This is a great question, one of the more popular ones. And to answer it, we can, of course, look at that one screenshot that I think you're referencing. To get directly to it, you do choose a nation at the start of the game. There were also questions on the video about could you customize it? The answer is yes. I've seen a menu where you can choose its name, pick from a selection of flags, choose the name of your leader, the kind of cultural style of the city as well, I believe, which is related back to the roughly 10 default nations in the game: France, Britain, Japan, etc., etc. On the topic of the bonuses, at the start of the game, they're somewhat limited. As far as I can tell, in this build, each nation, or whatever you want to call them, has one ability. It might be more production in the city centre, greater influence, but the national spirits and how you progress through the ages as well play a more important role, I would argue. So we're going to loop in one single ant who asks, on the topic of civilization, secondly, for government types, how much do they change gameplay? Are the gameplay differences between governments mainly from different bonuses, or actual gameplay differences. And thanks for your kind words at the end of the comment there too. To drill into your question specifically, the government types remind me a little bit of the good old-fashioned Civ 5 culture tree, if we just zoomed in on one part, say tradition. Though I would add, it's a bit more sort of on steroids. The effects are more pronounced and also more specific. Let's not forget as well that moving through the ages will kind of impact your civilization as well. If you're going through a lot of chaos ages, that will probably lean you towards more militarism, and you're probably not very good with your resource management. A more harmonious play would of course lead you more towards diplomacy and a peaceful victory. And then the final layer, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, are the national spirits. This is probably where the most customization for your Civ comes in. You choose 4 of them, as I mentioned last time, at ages 2, 4, 6, and 8 respectively, and as you can see, they're very specialized. In the early game, you're looking at ancient seafarers, wildlife hunters, raiders, and Spartans, and through the late game, you've got political scientists and all sorts of other advanced things, space explorers, you name it. The later game, ideologies and factions also develop. Ideology you're probably familiar with, pretty similar to other games. Factions kind of like groupings within them. Quite fascinating. And quite impactful. Moving through to our related question, George Torres8275 says, great intro, thank you. Thanks for the kind words. Promising I'll keep an eye on it. Unless I missed it, I didn't see any bonuses that buildings gave you. Can you talk about it? You did miss it a little bit, but I don't blame you. This is a new game, you've not played it, you've not seen it, so we're going to talk about it. Your other question about national spirits presented as tech trees with branches that develop further is absolutely true, but your last point, if I choose ancient seafarers, does it have branches that lead to deep sea navigation and eventually displace exploration, is just not quite true. So the bonuses that buildings give you, and by the way, the same currency, XP, is used for national spirits, are represented here in the domains: a government exploration, warfare engineering, diplomacy, and arts. And in my experience, playing right the way through, these are the 6. The other things that you're seeing in here, tribal, god king dynasty, spice merchants, these are ways to further customize your either your government or your society through that kind of national spirit lens, or through choosing a government type. Both of them work in similar ways once you've unlocked them. You get that tech tree, you're absolutely right, just like the culture tree from Civ 5, but more advanced. You need to choose one spot in each and you can make your way through maybe 10 options. To answer the second part of your question, in how they relate to one another as you move through, you're not ring-fenced. So if I chose the Spartan option here, which uses my military, buildings, and tile improvements to generate this experience, and then I can use that experience on either one-time abilities like healing my army, or inside of this tree, picking at least one option from each bit. They don't explicitly relate to one another. Like I say, you're not ring-fenced. You can choose, say, an engineering one like God King Dynasty one time, and then as you move through, choose an exploration one. But they are related. They tend to give bonuses towards the kind of domain that they lean into. Obviously, if you're an ancient seafarer, you're going to get exploration points. And then as you move through into the later game, which I can't show you, but as you move through, the, say, space explorers, where you're trying to complete a space mission, not to win, but for clout and other rewards, are also explorers. So there is definitely a benefit in focusing in on one tree and a certain type of stuff, but you could also choose to play it pretty broad and have quite a diverse civilization. On to our next question. Gamer Serg asks, in games like this, where you pick traits to build your Civ, eventually some end up being the best choice, and optimum builds are found making replay because you always want to pick the best traits. Thoughts? My thoughts are fairly straightforward here. Yes, Gamer Serg, absolutely. I think that human beings are a little bit like water. We're always going to find the path of least resistance. And on top of that, we're always going to want to find the best, the greatest strategy. So yeah, I don't know what they'll be yet, but for sure. Moving on to ages and the endgame. Barrel3D asks, have you been able to try the endgame? If so, does it keep being entertaining? Or does it become repetitive, like a lot of grand strategy games? That kind of one more turn syndrome may be wearing off. And I'm pleased to report that I have played a Q-hole game on it. I wouldn't have been able to make that last video with only 30 turns played in this bad boy, because it develops a lot over time. would say about the late game is, firstly, I've only experienced the extreme end game once. So I can't really just give you a definitive answer right now. I do think though, looking at the trailer, that if there is hope for this being different, and it's an if, by the way, that the ages system could very well be the thing that does lift it through. Because you have ages that are chaos, challenge related, an invasion of barbarians, maybe an alien invasion in the late game, or ones that are focused more around harmony, there's kind of this thing that could keep you pulled back in and interested. But I'm certainly not confident enough yet to make that claim. So sorry, a little bit of a half-assed answer, but that's what you're getting. Moving on to a double whammy, Phobia Zzz asks, so, can you finish one game in hours or days? Is the gameplay moving to different planets in the late game? Well, friend, to answer the first part of your question, my game, where by the way, that I played through to the end, I completely dominated. By about the 3rd or 4th age, I was comfortably ahead. I was quite aggressively pursuing technologies that would allow me to move through the ages as fast as I could if I wanted to, i.e. lots of research, and the game took me around 10 hours. For context, at turn 100 it was age 3, the year was 580, and at the end of the game at turn around 350, the year was 1900, so I definitely finished a bit ahead of schedule. On to the topic of moving planets and how that late game actually plays out. In my experience, there were 4 options: Transcendence Age, Archangel Age, Space Colonization, and an AI Singularity one. Now, an Archangel, maybe a big, city-destroying satellite, for example, is perhaps a more aggressive Crisis Age. I went through Transcendence, it was nice and peaceful, I just built up my national spirit and pulled everyone in with me. But ultimately, of course, the choice will be yours. In terms of actually moving to other planets, like a Stellaris kind of game, no, that's not the experience. Moving through to one of the most important questions, despite it having no upvotes, from Duct Tape and Dreams, how controllable are the ages you go into? Would you ever want to go into a Crisis Age, Age of Blood? Are there punishments? Or do you need to have certain things happen? Should you avoid things? And then another question, does everyone on the map go into the same ages, or are they different per civilization? Well, into the first part, you need to meet certain conditions to move through. Usually it's 3 technologies for the generic age, and then the other ones have preconditions. Specifically on the Age of Blood here, as you can see, you need to make sure that you destroy at least 6 other nations' units in battle, and probably build up a bit of crisis. And you can do that by maybe your cities aren't very well resourced, or maybe you're just going out and fighting a lot of people. On to the second part of your question, and maybe the more important part. As you're moving through Stone, Bronze, Blood, Crisis Kings, whatever it may be, what happens to everyone else and how does it work? Well, how does it work? You research it. And usually in my experience, it's pretty expensive, maybe 2 or 3 times as expensive as a technology in the era. The upside is, firstly, that you set the direction of control for everyone. Because once one player researches and moves through to an age, that's the age of the world. The second benefit is you usually receive some, maybe like a minus 10% on future technologies or something else to incentivize you. Now I'm going to move on to some rapid fire questions. Firstly, how many turns do you spend in an age, and are you able to research text going back? Yes, you are able to research text going back. You'll find that cheaper, easier to pick up, of course. And how many turns do you spend in an average age is a little bit of a difficult one for me to answer, to be honest. I'd need to play on maybe larger map sizes against more difficult opponents to really get a good feel for it. I'd say it probably took about 30 or 40 turns. That's on normal, by the way. There are 5 different difficulty options. Next, a few questions. Is there a game replay at the end? In the current build, there was not for me. How is the strategy view of the map if you pull back? I constantly find myself trying to scroll out more. I'd like to be able to scroll out and see more of the map. And is there any other game I can compare it to? Civ 6 is, I guess, kind of close. How's the feel of the game? Does it have a feel of paradox, grand strategy? Is there a steep learning curve? Or is it more of a typical 4X? Initially, I'd thought there was some grand strategy simulation elements at play, and I still think there are, but it probably falls into the typical 4X category. I'm really curious about diplomacy, says Loco Dragon. Is it on the Civ 6 level, more like CK3? This one I would say, well, you send an envoy to an enemy city, a friendly city, and then you get most of the options that you would expect in Civ 6. Declare war, take my religion, all sorts of other things. I think it's roughly on par. And then finally, how big is the game? Well, the game defaults to, I think, 10 players. It's probably, in terms of map size, roughly on par with the likes of Civilization or Humankind. Maybe slightly larger, because the cities tend to be larger. You can expand them with towns. They can stretch across, 10, 12 tiles wide. To the slightly longer form ones from 5732. So is the combat a bit like old Fire Emblem? Thank you so much, by the way, for writing this comment. Units meet on a big map, then you get a little 2D screen with the two opponents fighting. And if you watch my last video, which I would recommend that you do, not for this great paint artwork, but actually because it probably helps to set the scene for this one, I showed you this image that I quickly mocked up that broadly shows what combat looks like. And when I look into your example, I think, yes, this is actually kind of what it looks like. I would say maybe it's a bit more two-dimensional, not to take away from the fact that it is still a 3D sort of rendering of these units moving left and right at each other, but I see some figures in the background here. That's not quite what it would look like. Instead, this character with the bow would have a character just across from them, and they'd sort of move back and forward and fight. It's hands-off once you've moved the units around the map. On to a more controversial and subjective topic. Normally I love the style of PDX games, but the graphics look shite. The menus look like they're out of a 10-year-old game, and the clouds are discussing. What are they discussing? The question is, does it really look like this, or is it better when you actually play? And look, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but let me be clear, you are not alone. This came up many times, and indeed it's something I've thought about quite a lot myself. My personal take is that the map appears somewhat too gritty, sometimes maybe a little bit blurred. My personal preference would to have it look something a little bit more like Humankind, slightly more color, the map a little bit more crisp. That being said, of course, it is ultimately up to an individual's taste. If you're a fan of Old World and the kind of graphics there, then you'll fit right at home here. I'm also kind of a fan of classic Civ 5, and it does have a little bit of that vibe to it in its more sort of realistic take, so I enjoy that part of it. But back to the question at its core, personally, I'd like to see it just have a little bit of a glow up, a little bit more clarity, a bit more crispness in the tiles, and maybe the removal of what can sometimes feel like just a slight blur across the map. On the topic of the UI, with the exception of the fact that the units are quite small and difficult to see, I don't really have an issue with it. I think it broadly suits the theme of the game. However, if I could make one change, it would be that it would change a little bit through the eras. It's not really that satisfying for me to interact with this kind of thing when the year is, say, 2003 and I'm flying to space. So I'd like to see in the full sort of future release that it moves a little bit more with the ages. And I do personally echo that sentiment around looking for something that is just a little bit more modern looking. That being said, I've found in my playtime it hasn't been that bad. Next question from Thymos7991. Could you go into more detail about social fabric, how that works? I'd also like to know more about the effects the ages have on the game. Do they drastically change gameplay compared to one another? We've already talked quite a bit about the ages, how the Blood Age turns the map red and puts everyone at war, the generic ones not so much. But to drill into your question about social fabrics, they broadly relate to these domains, warfare, exploration, but they might have sort of slightly different names. I can't quite recall. And I also can't really answer your question because the game is missing a lot of information about them, including the tooltips. I couldn't for the life of me figure out which yield they were influencing, but what I do know is that they affect some of the other broader aspects at the very least. Some ages, for example, might have a requirement, like you have a certain level of a warfare spirit within you. On to our penultimate question, although actually it's 3. Did you get one more turn syndrome? Anything else differentiates civs beside normal spirits? And did you feel as though your civ had character? Oh, and actually there's a 4th. Are the ages specific to each civ, or is it a global thing? We've already answered that, it's global. Going back one, do you feel as though your civ had character? I suppose? I'm not really sure. I haven't thought about it. The character is developed as you move through the national spirits, so it's not like, hey, I'm France, look at my French units. It's more like, this is the nation that I've built. Civs, as I mentioned earlier, though, do have a unique trait at the beginning, I believe, and of course, a cosmetic look, flag, etc. And then on to the final part of your question, one more turn syndrome. Well, so far, yes. But when you've only really been playing it properly for a few days, and it's new, I'd say that's almost always going to be the case. So I'm not really confident enough to make a definitive statement either way about its far future. I'm sorry, it's just not quite ready to make that call. And finally, thank you, by the way, for being a member of the channel for 2 years. I hope you've had some fun and excitement out of it. Gamer Physics asks, were you playing this when you released the teaser video a few days ago? A great question. I've had early access for a few weeks. When I first got it, I played the game for about 30 minutes. The build that I had, for whatever reason, didn't work well on my system. I threw it to one side. Once they started teasing it again, I thought, oh, maybe I should take another look. There'd been some updates to the version that I had, and it started working properly on my computer. Huzzah! Despite, of course, its flaws being still a very early version. And so I made that teaser video. Of course, I couldn't say anything that I knew from my 36 minutes of playtime, but that didn't matter because they were already at that point teasing it in the public. So of course, the video focused only and exclusively around things that were in the public. And now here we are. And I've played a few sort of start games, half sort of test kind of things, and one full game through all 10 of the ages. One final note, you can win earlier on. You don't have to play through all 10 of these. If you're really dominating people, I was given the option, for example, in age 3 to win through some kind of conquest, and then in age 6 if I managed to convert 2/3 of the world to my religion. So there's definitely a lot more to unpack. Of course, if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer more, but equally, I don't want to bore you to death. So let me know below, and I'll see you next time.